I've always been one of those people who loves bedtime stories. As a child, my grandmother would read me tales of magic and adventure that transported me to far-off lands and fantastical creatures. But as I grew older, my taste for storytelling shifted towards something darker, more sinister. It was then that I discovered Kelsi Davies' bedtime stories. The first time I heard her voice, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Her tone was low and soothing, yet laced with an undercurrent of malevolence that made me feel like I was listening to something I shouldn't be. At first, I dismissed it as mere paranoia, but as the nights went on, I found myself drawn back to her stories again and again. There was something about Kelsi's voice that seemed to know exactly what buttons to press, what fears to exploit. It was as if she had a sixth sense for understanding what made me tick, what made my skin crawl. And so, I began to investigate the source of her stories. I scoured the internet for any mention of Kelsi Davies, but there was nothing. No website, no social media presence, no clues of any kind. It was as if she existed only in the shadows, waiting to strike when least expected. But I couldn't resist the allure of her voice, and so I continued to listen, even though a part of me whispered that I should stop while I still could. It was on a typical Wednesday evening, around 9 p.m., that I first heard Kelsi's voice. I was sitting in my darkened room, trying to wind down before bed, when suddenly the air seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly presence. At first, I thought it might be just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard her voice low, husky, and dripping with an eerie sweetness that sent shivers down my spine. She was reading a story, or so I assumed, though the words themselves were indistinguishable from the static-filled background noise. Yet, as I listened more closely, I began to make out phrases and sentences that seemed to weave together into a narrative that both fascinated and repelled me. The voice seemed to be speaking directly to me, but whenever I looked up from my phone, there was no one there. No one at all. It was as if the darkness itself had coalesced into a presence that could only be perceived through the medium of sound. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just some prankster or a weirdo who'd taken an interest in me, but deep down, I knew something was amiss. The voice continued to speak for what felt like hours, its words dripping with an unsettling intimacy that made my skin crawl. And yet, despite the creeping sense of dread that threatened to consume me whole, I found myself drawn deeper into her world, unable to look away from the morbid spectacle unfolding before me. I listened to the first story, which seemed to be a simple tale of a young girl who wanders into an abandoned carnival at night. The voice spoke in hushed tones, her words painting vivid pictures of rickety booths and Ferris wheels that creaked and groaned like restless spirits. As I listened, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease, as if the darkness outside my window was seeping into my room, tendrils of shadowy air curling around my ankles like cold fingers. The voice spoke of how the girl had stumbled upon an old funhouse, its mirrors reflecting distorted images that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I felt a shiver run down my spine as Kelsi's voice described the girl's desperate attempt to escape, only to find herself trapped in a maze of twisting corridors and dead-end rooms. The story was mesmerizing, yet repulsive, like watching a train wreck that you couldn't look away from. As the tale drew to a close, I felt a sense of disorientation, as if my own reality had been subtly altered by the voice's words. When I looked around my room, I noticed that the shadows seemed to have shifted, taking on new, twisted forms that seemed to mock me with their very presence. It was then that I realized I wasn't just listening to a story. I was being initiated into a world of darkness and terror, one that Kelsi Davies was expertly guiding me through. As the nights went on, I found myself becoming increasingly uneasy. Kelsi's voice would weave its way through my dreams, leaving me feeling unsettled and on edge. The stories she told were no longer just tales of horror. They seemed to be seeping into my waking life, making even the mundane tasks feel like a struggle. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside made me jump, my heart racing with anticipation. I began to feel like I was living in a state of constant hypervigilance, waiting for the next event to occur. And yet, despite the growing sense of unease that threatened to consume me whole, I found myself drawn back to Kelsi's stories again and again. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of twisted feedback loop, where the more I listened, the more I needed to listen. The voice seemed to be feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each passing night. I began to feel like I was losing control, like Kelsi was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And then there were the dreams. Oh God, the dreams. They were always so vivid, so real. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, with the images from Kelsi's stories seared into my mind like branding irons. The abandoned carnival, the funhouse mirrors, the twisted corridors. It was all still there, lingering just beneath the surface of my consciousness. It was as if I was being slowly driven mad by the voice, my grip on reality tenuous at best. As I lay in bed, listening to Kelsi's voice weave its way through my dreams, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. It started with small things. A book on the shelf would shift ever so slightly, or a chair creaked beneath an invisible weight. At first, I wrote it off as mere paranoia, but as the night wore on, the occurrences grew more frequent and more pronounced. The shadows in my room began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. I could feel their presence, a cold, dark energy that seemed to seep into my very pores. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. The voice had started to seep into the physical world, bringing with it an aura of malevolent intent. I felt like I was being watched, like unblinking eyes were trained on me from the darkness. I threw off the covers and sat up in bed, my heart racing with anticipation. And then I saw them, shadowy figures, lurking just beyond the reach of the moonlight that filtered through the blinds. They didn't move or speak, but their presence was palpable, a cold, dark force that seemed to fill the room. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare, with Kelsi's voice whispering cruel taunts in my ear. The shadows began to take shape, forming into twisted, grotesque forms that seemed to leer at me from the darkness. I knew then that I had to get out of there, but as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I felt a cold hand on my ankle, holding me back. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone in the room, and that Kelsi's voice wasn't just in my head. I listened to the second story, which seemed to be a dark and twisted tale of a young girl who discovers a mysterious box in her attic. The voice spoke in hushed tones, its words dripping with an eerie intimacy that sent shivers down my spine. As I listened, I felt myself being drawn into the world of the story, where the lines between reality and fantasy began to blur. The voice described the box as being made of a strange, otherworldly material that seemed to absorb sound and light around it. It was as if the box was a void, a portal to some dark and ancient realm that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. I felt my heart racing with anticipation as Kelsi's voice described the girl's initial fascination with the box, her curiosity getting the better of her as she began to explore its strange properties. But as the story progressed, it became clear that the box was not what it seemed. It was a key, a doorway to a realm of madness and terror that lurked just beyond the edge of reality. I felt my grip on sanity begin to slip as Kelsey's voice described the girl's descent into madness, her world being turned upside down by the secrets that the box revealed. The story ended abruptly, leaving me feeling shaken and disturbed. But it was only then that I realized the true horror of what I had just listened to. The box was not just a prop, but a metaphor for the darkness that lurked within myself. Kelsey's voice had unlocked a door in my mind, revealing a world of fears and anxieties that I had long suppressed. And as I sat there, frozen with fear, I knew that I would never be able to escape the darkness that had been unleashed upon me. As I sat there, frozen with fear, I felt Kelsey's voice begin to taunt me, to question my own sanity. She seemed to be enjoying my distress, her words dripping with a malevolent glee that sent shivers down my spine. "Are you sure you're not just making all of this up?" she asked, her voice like a cold wind blowing through my mind. "Is it really possible that there's something out there waiting for us? Or are you just so scared that your imagination is running wild with possibilities?" I felt a wave of self-doubt wash over me, as if Kelsey was right. Maybe I wasn't as sane as I thought. Maybe the stories she was telling were true, and I was just too afraid to face the truth. But then I remembered something, the box. The mysterious box that had been the catalyst for all of this, and I knew that I couldn't let Kelsey's taunts get inside my head. I had to keep fighting no matter how scared I was. "No," I said out loud, my voice firm and resolute. "I know what I've heard, I know what I've seen, and I won't be swayed by your tricks." Kelsey's laughter was like a cold breeze on a winter's night, but I stood tall, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time, I felt a sense of determination, of purpose. I would see this through to the end, no matter what lay ahead. As I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I felt the tension build to a fever pitch. Kelsey's voice was like a snake slithering through the grass, always just out of reach, but always seeming to come closer. She seemed to be enjoying my discomfort, her words dripping with a sadistic glee that made my skin crawl. "Come on," she whispered, her voice like a rusty gate scraping against concrete. "Try to escape me." I felt a surge of adrenaline as I turned to make a run for it, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. Kelsey's laughter was like a cold wind blowing through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "You can't hide from me," she taunted. "I'm always here, waiting for you." I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only seemed to intensify as Kelsey's words washed over me like a wave. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan to escape her grasp, but every door I turned down led back to the same old fear and uncertainty. The tension built to a crescendo, making my head feel like it was going to split open from the pressure. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, Kelsey's voice stopped. The silence was like a scream in itself, making me feel like I was going to collapse under its weight. But then, suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I was alone with my fear, and it seemed to be closing in on me from all sides. As I stood there in the darkness, I felt Kelsey's voice begin to whisper again, her words dripping with an even greater sense of malevolence than before. "This is the third story," she hissed, "and it's the one that will consume you completely." Suddenly, a faint light flickered to life in the corner of the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a shiver run down my spine as Kelsey began to speak, her voice weaving a dark and sinister tale that seemed to sear itself into my brain. "In this story," she whispered, "there is no escape from the darkness that lies within." As she spoke, the room began to change around me, the walls seeming to close in on me like a trap. I felt myself being pulled down into a deep well of despair with no way out. The third story was a descent into madness, and I knew that I was powerless to stop it. Kelsey's voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. "You can't escape the truth," she screamed. You have to face it head on. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. The room was silent and still, the only sound the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But I knew that I wasn't alone. Kelsi's presence lingered in the air, a malevolent force that seemed to be watching me even as I lay there. I lay on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. The room was silent and still, but I could feel Kelsi's presence lurking just out of sight. As I struggled to sit up, a wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me back down onto the cold concrete. My mind was a jumble of fragmented thoughts and half-remembered fears, but one thing was clear: I had to escape. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me like a leaf in an autumn gale. Kelsi's voice whispered in my ear, her words a maddening litany of doubt and fear. "You'll never be free," she hissed. "You'll never be sane." I felt myself losing touch with reality, slipping down a slippery slope of madness from which there was no return. The room began to distort and twist around me, like a funhouse mirror reflecting all my deepest fears back at me. I stumbled through the twisting corridors, desperate to escape the grasp of Kelsi's sinister influence. But every door I opened led only to more terrors, more nightmarish visions that threatened to consume me whole. My grip on reality began to slip, fragmenting into 1,000 tiny pieces that scattered across the floor like dust in the wind. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, Kelsi appeared before me, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice a cold wind blowing through my very soul. "You'll never be free again." As I stood there, frozen in terror, Kelsi's face seemed to twist and contort before my eyes. Her eyes, once bright and inquisitive, now burned with an otherworldly intensity that made my blood run cold. "You want to know the truth about me?" she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You want to know what I've been doing all these years?" She took a step closer, her eyes glinting with a sinister light. "I wasn't just a photographer," she hissed. "I was a collector of souls." My mind reeled as Kelsi's words hung in the air like a challenge. What did she mean? What kind of soul collecting was she talking about? And then, like a punch to the gut, it hit me. The pictures, the photographs. They weren't just random snaps of people going about their daily lives. They were recording them, capturing their essence, their souls, and trapping them in a never-ending cycle of terror. Kelsi's eyes seemed to gleam with pride as she watched my reaction. "You see, I've been collecting souls for years," she whispered, "and each one adds to my collection." My mind was racing now, trying to comprehend the sheer scope of Kelsi's depravity. But before I could ask any questions, Kelsi spoke again, her voice dripping with venom. "And now you're mine." She reached out a hand and touched my face, her fingers cold and clammy against my skin. I felt a chill run down my spine as Kelsi's eyes seemed to bore into my very soul. "You'll make a fine addition to my collection," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. Kelsi's words echoed in my mind. "You'll make a fine addition to my collection." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I had been living in a world that was not my own. The world that Kelsi had created for me was one of terror and madness, where the lines between reality and fantasy were blurred beyond recognition. I thought back to all the moments that had led me to this point, the strange occurrences, the unexplained events, the eerie photographs that seemed to haunt me everywhere I went. It was all just a product of Kelsi's fevered imagination, a twisted game she had designed to drive me mad. And yet, as I looked at my own reflection, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to it than that. That there was something real out there, waiting to be uncovered. I thought about all the questions I had asked myself during this journey. What is real? What is just a product of our own fevered imagination? And the answer, much like Kelsi's true intentions, remained elusive. All I knew was that I had been forever changed by this experience, that my perception of reality had been shifted irreversibly. As I turned away from the mirror, I couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered?